And then somebody showed up in a shiny white truck. It was not us. Actually, I don't know who it was. They showed up and they drove right into the midst of this organized chaos of cleanup after a major flood. And they parked their truck right in the middle of all the activity. Leon, how much would you like it if somebody pulled their truck right in the middle of one of your jobs? You know? Pulled it in, stepped out of the truck, and said some version of, "I'm in charge here." Well, the guy running the show, first thing he said was, "Get your truck off my job site." Second of all, "We're doing just fine without you, thanks," or some version of that. And the next thing that happened was the guy was like, "No, I'm supposed to be in charge here." And I'm sure that somebody in a committee room somewhere sent him and said, "Look, you're going to be in charge of this cleanup site." But it was kind of more the attitude. "Hey, I'm here. You need to do what I'm telling you now." The story, as I heard it, ended when the guy who really was in charge there called one of his guys over with a bobcat with forks on it. The guy drove up underneath the shiny white pickup truck and gave him some version of, "Are you going to move this truck or am I?" I tell that story, okay, because I heard it straight from, like I said, a retired police chief who I'm sure wouldn't pull my leg about anything, but as an example of who we never, ever want to be. The week before that story happened, or the week after, time kind of fades with me as I get a little older, we had gone in. It was during COVID. Our director would not allow us to drive in the same car. You know, we were trying to figure out all those things. We took 4 shiny white vehicles into that area. We went down one street and we started to get close to where the action was, and all of us instantly felt uncomfortable. So we turned a street before we got to the disaster. We parked 6 or 8 blocks away. And we walked down into where we could see what was going on. And we used that as an opportunity to assess it for ourselves. That's more who we want to be. And those partnerships are absolutely critical, because who am I from Holland, Michigan, or who are we from Byron Center, Michigan, to come into somebody else's community and tell them what they need to do to fix their problem? They are there, and those long-term recovery organizations are there to help their people recover from something that's disastrous, literally, and to move their communities forward into recovery. And that takes a long, long time, and they're the people who know how best to do it. And we are there to provide volunteers, to provide information, to provide networking and connections, to provide sometimes trucks and trailers and tools. We're there to come alongside and to go where they tell us to go, not to where we want to go. And where they tell us to go are into the places with the most vulnerability. People unlike my grandma, who may not have networks of people with equipment and tools ready to jump right in. People who probably are either uninsured or extremely underinsured. There's all kinds of complications that happen when your basement floods in New Jersey or in Detroit. And all kinds of ways, even people who are insured don't always get the help that they really need in order to recover from that. And that's who we're there to help with. Now I want to check on my time for a second, because I know I can go for a while. So there's 3 things I want to talk about, 3 more things I want to talk about with programs. We do several specific things, and I'll go through these quickly. You can find there's information in the back on the back table out in the, what do we call that back behind the chapel? What's the name of that? The hallway. Okay, back there. There's a table. All this stuff is outlined there. We do cleanup work. We call it rapid response, but we're changing that phrasing to be more of an early response, because rapid response implies that there's the National Guard, okay, and their helicopters, and here's World Renew coming in right behind them. No, we usually get in anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks after a major event. I was in North Carolina in New Bern a month after Hurricane Florence hit, and I was in with the first team of ours that had there. So we provide that. We put volunteers in these places once we have a partner on the ground who has a place for our volunteers to sleep and the ability to point our volunteers to who needs the help. So that's the earliest we're generally on the ground, is doing that cleanup work. We've been doing that work in Detroit all summer long, since the first week that this happened. On Friday, I had a chance to serve with Deanna and with Emily from Christ Memorial. It was a joy to serve alongside Christ Memorial volunteers. If you're looking for a way to get your I'm not going to say feet wet because that's terrible, but if you're looking for a way to get started in volunteering, that doesn't mean you have to travel 1,000 miles away and be gone for 1 to 3 weeks. I know that we are going to have needs for doing cleanup work in basements that were flooded, and that work of just cleanup is going to last months into the future. 4,000 homes were impacted by that. We're still working on Lakewood Street in the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood, one street, and we've been there all summer going 1 day a week, all summer long. It's work that can be done by just about anybody, and for those who get tired and need to take a break, you can have some amazing conversations with the homeowners who will share their story of how God has been faithful. We heard one of those from a woman named Cheryl yesterday, or Friday, and those stories are amazing to hear. So that's our early one. We also have more of a social work piece to what we do. It's called our Unmet Needs Assessment Program. And that generally comes sometime after the cleanup work is kind of underway, but before they've figured out exactly what they need and how to get all the resources to actually put things back together. And so we'll send a team of volunteers, and they'll go out for about 2 weeks. And sometimes they go door to door in a community. And again, this isn't on our own. We're working with a long-term recovery organization telling us which neighborhoods and which doors to knock on. Or we may even have a drop-in center. During COVID, we needed to get creative because all of those things that we would typically do would put us face-to-face, which is where we love to be with people. And so we were able to train volunteers in those communities to do these, and then the training all happened remotely so that local volunteers did this part. Because in case you didn't notice, the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the floods, they didn't get quarantined. They kept coming and coming and coming. That unmet needs assessment is where I would see my wife Tammy someday loving to volunteer, to go out for 2 weeks to help people do the paperwork that's necessary to get their information into the system, so that when the long-term recovery group goes to FEMA or to the state emergency management and says, we need $5 million to do X number of houses, okay, that's where that information goes. It goes in and applies for the larger dollars and helps people recover. So it's the social work part. And then we have long-term recovery, which is construction. That's where someone has met with a case manager. The case manager knows that Mrs. Jones needs this amount of work. It's going to cost this amount of money. Look, we found this money over here. We're going to get Mrs. Jones back in her house. We're going to take a group from Christ Memorial Church, and they're going to be one of 8 or 9 groups that work on that house. And they're going to go for a week, and we're going to steer them to help Mrs. Jones. And we're going to have a construction manager there and a volunteer coordinator, and we're going to work with that group from Christ Memorial or Fellowship Reformed Hudsonville, and soon, hopefully, Fellowship Reformed Holland. These are churches that I've gotten to work with very closely over the years, and we are steered in to work with those. The long-term recovery, just to put it in perspective, Hurricane Florence happened 3 years ago in September. I'm sending groups to North Carolina this fall that are still working on homes. I was in North Carolina last February, so February of 2021. I got to do my math. I get mixed up lately. And we had given a grant to put a new roof on a woman's home. That roof had been leaking since September of 2018. And her bedrooms were molding one at a time. She was isolating her house so that she was living on one end, and she had plastic covered up, and she'd been living like that since this disaster happened. Many of the homeowners that we work with have nowhere to go. And so they can live for months and years in houses that none of us would want to live in. And certainly if we had elderly parents, we would not want them living in those conditions. And many of the folks that we're serving would be in that most vulnerable population. They're older. We work with a lot of single widows and widowers, and it is conditions that are really, really tough. But the long-term recovery can take years. It can take years. World Renew is never the first person on the ground. Like I said, there are other people who do that emergency management. Samaritan's Purse and Team Rubicon are amazing at deploying volunteers to go in for that initial cleanup phase. They have equipment that we can't even dream of. So we're not the first ones ever in, but very often, as we work our way through long-term recovery in the communities that we serve, we're among the last people to leave. We're among the last people to leave. And that long, steady, patient work is really, really important to us. And it means that the people who are most vulnerable and have no way to make it happen quicker, they get help. And then the last one is people. World Renew works with volunteers, and I'm going to really focus on volunteers. We work with volunteers of all ages. So I send out youth groups regularly that have students as young as 14, but we also send out volunteers that are up into their 80s. Remember that storm that hit Jenison, was it 2 summers ago? Just real quick, microburst or whatever it was, and it took out all kinds of trees in Jenison. I have a picture, and it's a video of Gord. And Gord is an 80-year-old volunteer of ours, former farmer. He jumped on that Kubota tractor, and he was hauling trees and brush all over that neighborhood. And Gord probably isn't going with us somewhere for 3 weeks and sleeping on a cot, in the church basement somewhere. But Gord jumped on that, and we heard a lot of stories about the old days when Gord was a newly retired guy, and Hurricane Katrina hit. And Gord was among the first World Renew volunteers down there with the same tractor and a chainsaw crew. But our volunteers are of all ages. When it comes to younger groups, who know what they're doing. We love to have the younger ones out there, but it's always good to have people who know what they're doing. We have adult Bible study groups that go out from different churches. We have all kinds of different people that go. They can go for 1 week if they go with the program that I oversee, or looking at what maybe some of you remember as the CRWRC model, they can go for 3 weeks. And almost all the people that go out on our 3-week sites are retired, and they have time. And almost all of our sites, incidentally, happen to be, for the most part, in the southern states. And so you can imagine that January, February, and even into March, those are quite popular times from people from Canada to Northwest Iowa to go. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about that. Volunteers of all skill levels. Every one of our partners has people on site. So we can take a volunteer group that isn't necessarily super skilled at any of these projects. However, I do always, like I said with the younger ones, it's always good for the benefit of your group to have 1 or 2 people who know what they're doing. It helps to have some of the people with the skills and the way of being wired to make a significant difference when disasters happen. And if there's any way that we can partner in the future with volunteers, I just wanted to say I would welcome that. I would love to serve side by side with more volunteers from Christ Memorial. I know that there are people here who could help make a huge difference in the world that's going on. Maybe one thing I will say is, as you watch the news over the next couple of months, hurricane season isn't done yet. If you could pray for the people who respond. Maybe if nothing else, you have a little bit better understanding of how churches can be involved and volunteers and local organizations. Pray for the survivors, please, because those people in very dark places. But if you would pray for those who will respond. Pray that the Lord will raise up an army of volunteers to help where volunteer help can be used. Pray for safety as volunteers go out and as they travel. Pray for that in the midst of the Delta variant of COVID. I haven't really talked about that all that much. You can imagine, as it has impacted everyone, from churches to schools to businesses, it's affected us. On March 12th of 2020, I was in Meridian, Mississippi. I was there alongside of a group of volunteers from Fellowship Reformed in Hudsonville who have gone out with us for years. Amazing people. And I was there with a group from Orland Park Christian Reformed Church who were from the Chicago area. Their specialty is to build an entire house in 5 weeks every single year, and they've done it for 13 years. And on Thursday, March 12th, we were in the living room, and the living room was, Brad, right, to Jerry, like right here. The living room was that small. We had 40 people crammed into this thing on March 12th. And we were giving Miss Mavis keys to a brand new home. Her home had been damaged 23 months before in a tornado. And she and her son, Malcolm, an adult son with some pretty significant handicaps, mental handicaps, they had lived in that damaged home for 23, 24 months. And she was getting the keys to her only brand new home she'll probably ever have in her life. It was a Mennonite Disaster Services model home. They have plans. They build these all over the country. It was a group, a Christian Reformed group and a Reformed Church group. They worked with Grand Valley State University students 2 weeks before on putting the insulation up under this house. And we handed her the keys, we prayed, we celebrated. I walked out the door and took a call from my boss that said, we're done. Call everybody home. And I canceled 400 volunteers from the second week of March through May 31st. And then, as you can imagine, as the summer went on, lots and lots more. But Miss Mavis wrote out all the quarantine that happened in a brand new home. And for that, I'm very, very grateful, as I lamented often, as we all have, many things that have been lost. I kept thinking about Miss Mavis, who wrote out that quarantine time and this pandemic in a brand new home. And we had volunteer leadership on each of those sites when we had to say we're done, who stayed a week or 2 weeks later. Many of them were living in their own RVs, so they were very self-contained. And so they left Mr. Smith down the road. You know, we had just torn out his kitchen and his bathroom because we were going to be there for 3 more months. And they left him before they left. They left him with a fully functional house. Maybe the paint wasn't completely right and the trim wasn't completely right. And those are the kind of volunteers that work with us and we love. So I'm going to close there, and we've got a few minutes left for some questions and answers if anybody has any. If they get that going, sure, we can watch that if they get it going. Yes, please. Okay, we're not at this point. We are waiting for a partner on the ground to call us in because right now there's so much destruction. What was the second name that you said? Thibodaux and Home. Yeah. Years ago, we had volunteers in Homa for a long time, before my time. She's asking if we're doing work in Thibodaux or Homa, Louisiana, right now. Her son lives down there. We were there years ago in Homa. I mean, again, it's an area that gets hit regularly. Yeah, last summer was bad. Yeah. Any other questions? Did it make sense? Yes.
Well, I just wanted to reiterate when you said that you'll take skill levels, all over. Well, my husband has gone out on a couple, maybe more.
I'm going to let you talk into this so everybody can hear.
In our previous church, we had a group that would go out. They would get volunteers, and my husband went and, worked on drywall, whatever it was. And I said, well, I'm not good at any of that. And you don't want me putting in electric or whatever. So, but I said, I can cook, So another friend and I, we went along and we did all the cooking and, and it was a wonderful experience, even from that area. So.
Some of you know Rick Page, and Rick went to Detroit with me a couple weeks ago, and we talked about Tammy and Jean cooking for a group, and Rick and I doing what we have done in Mississippi in the past. Yeah, anybody, any more questions? All right, I guess we'll close with the video, and I'm just going to say thank you very much. It's really good to see all of you. Thanks. The Gulf Coast got hit, and then it got hit again. I think the surprise disaster for us was the Midland flooding. Flooding began with some rain that just kept coming down and falling and falling. There's a series of about 5 dams on the Tittabawassee and the Tobacco River. The water backed up way upstream and began to flood homes. And then the second part of the disaster happened when 2 of those dams failed.
So we had over 10,000 people had to evacuate their homes. And they did it within hours. And my wife and I looked at that for a minute. We said, that's like half of the city is evacuating. COVID was going to be a major barrier to doing anything that we wanted to do. How do we let people know that we're available? Who needs to hear about this? And we had people showing up within an hour. I knew that World Renew DRS was going to be one of my first calls.
Mike called to make a connection. We talked about immediate steps. Well, there are several stages that go into disaster recovery. So there's cleanup, there is a forming of a local long-term recovery group, and then there is long-term recovery that can go from 2 to 5 years out into the future. Totally depends on the disaster. But not everybody who goes out on a World Renew DRS response has to be able to tear things up or build things, because sometimes the real ministry happens in honoring and blessing the survivors of these disasters.
I think a core DRS volunteer is a person who just has it in their heart to be able to want to help someone else.
I feel that God is leading us and other people to be the responders in these disaster situations. And I could be part of tearing down the old and helping to bring a better situation. That has been a blessing to me.
We were able to bring together pastors from all across our county, all across Gladwin, into Bay County.
And I think that if there's any lessons to learn in that, it's love your neighbor now, because you never know what might happen later. In this case, that concern and that relationship that existed before has been an unbelievable strength for them in moving forward, in helping that community recover from this disaster, and having the churches be a significant part of that recovery.
What if recovery isn't just a return to normal, right? But what if recovery actually accelerates us to something that we've never seen before, and something that's even better and more beautiful than we had before the flood?
That money that you give will go to support volunteer response from World Renewed Disaster Response Services across North America. Right now, that active volunteer response is less than it's been in the past due to COVID, but we have been incredibly active at trying to find ways to support organizations, even in the midst, and that's where that money has been spent in 2020. So that was a video we put together last fall, and it went out to supporting churches on through the spring and the winter. If there's ever any information you'd like about World Renew, if you're interested in learning more, Deanna Onk is over here. She is my contact here. So Dee's going to be doing the work of organizing any possible volunteer response from Christ Memorial. Any questions at all, please reach out to her. She and I talk regularly. A real simple one would be to come to Detroit if you are able at some point in the near future. We're going to be there for a long time to come. Beyond that, North Carolina, California, Texas, there's a lot of work to be done. And please remember to pray for those folks as you watch the news. So with that, I'm going to end this part, but I'll be around. If you have any other questions or just want to talk, I'd be glad to stick around for a little bit. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris. Good deal. Hey, thanks again for coming. Next week, we have Dr. Rich Ray and Dr. David Stubbs from Hope College, who are going to be talking about visiting the prisoner in a classroom. So we hope to see all of you and many more back here next week. Thanks again for coming. All right. Hello, Mark.